Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a PowerPoint. If you can just put it up on the screen so we can all follow. So since I'm here, I would say Assalamu alaikum. And in the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. And we thank the King of Morocco and the Academy for inviting me both to chair yesterday and to speak today. This conference has an amazing team, and I would urge all of you to just reflect on it in your quiet time. Those who crafted the team really thought through it, I think, because Africa as a horizon for thought is appropriate in these times. Also, today is, as you know, Human Rights Day, according to the UN, and so I'm glad to be making these remarks on such a day. I don't know how many of you were present at the opening ceremony 2 days ago, but the head of the Moroccan Academy made a statement that I haven't since forgotten. He said that we need an Africa that will think on its own and for its own. Very profound statement. But we cannot achieve thinking on our own and for our own unless we change the language we use for such thoughts and change the meaning of the words that are used to communicate our thoughts as Africans and about our progress as a people. So, in other words, we need to rid ourselves of what somebody said today is linguistic intoxication. But I would recast that and call it etymological toxification. We need to take the toxins out of the words that are used to describe popular governance and popular development terminologies, and which we are forced to use to determine our own progress. So in the next few minutes, I will discuss the popular meaning of some words that are often used in the democratic parlance and in the development parlance. And then I would suggest that we need to change the meaning of those words. I would then suggest the new meanings that we should use for those words. Before I start, I want to give a note of caution. I'm not asking for pointless exceptionalism. I'm not saying that Africa should be exceptional in the way in which it gives meaning to these words and applies them to their development just because we are African. What I'm saying is that we need an African self-realization and self-actualization. And if we have to be exceptional to do that, we have to do it. So we are not talking about etymological autarky or cloisteredness. We are not saying take these words and apply them only to Africa. We are saying that use them to self-realize ourselves and to self-actualize. Without that, unless we do that, our blind pursuit of the dreams of others who have encapsulated that dream in the words they craft and assign meaning to, and then foist on us to imbibe, to think with, and to act by, will not lead us where we want to go. Now, the words that I want us to look at are here: governance, government, democratic governance, good governance, people-oriented administration, constitutionalism, administration, institutions, globalization. These are very popular words. We hear them every day when you're talking about democracy and when you're talking about development. But what do these mean? When people use them, what do they mean? and what should they mean? So we start with governance. Anytime people talk about governance, they misdefine it to mean only political governance. Think about it. But, so as long as we run elections every 4, 5, 6, 7 years, you are fine. But they exclude economic, social, cultural governance. The economic, social, and cultural dimensions of governance are extracted away from the popular definition of governance. When you do that, then we cannot ask how our economies are governed and where all our resources are going, because the economic definition is absent from the political definition of governance. We cannot ask how our airwaves are saturated with cultures of everyone else but ourselves, because the social and cultural definition of governance is outside of the narrow political definition of governance. So rather than live with this dangerous definition of governance, we need to redefine the term governance to include the rules of the game for generating resources, distributing them, and resolving attendant conflicts. That's what governance is about. Governance is a resource struggle. If we realize that governance is about resources, broadly defined to include power resources, economic and natural resources, social, cultural, spiritual resources, then we would start watching for the economic, social, and cultural dimensions of governance. That will be the beginning of what I call the governance revolution in Africa. Flowing from this myopic definition of governance extends to the definition of government, because the government is then said to be the body that does what? That governs. If you define governance wrongly, then you define government narrowly as politicians, not so. And so when we talk about bad governance, we are talking about politicians stealing 10% of the resources. But we never stop to ask where the 90% of the resources are going. Would we rather save the 90% that are being lost through poor economic and social governance, or we just focus on the 10% that politicians are stealing? So that misdefinition of governance leads us to a misdefinition of government with all its associated costs. So all those people who can mobilize political, economic, social, spiritual capital and determine the way in which resources are distributed and how people act are government, not just the few politicians. If we concentrate on only them, we're looking at 10% of the piece and leaving out 90% of the piece. That same definition of government often excludes regional and local government, because the focus is all on the small number of people in central government in the capital. It also ignores all the lawyers and judges who determine how resources are distributed through the cases they decide. Because in the final analysis, issues of politics and economics go to the courts, and they decide who has what, when, and how. But we leave them out of this narrow definition of government. So all those who play a role in determining where resources go are the government. Now, democratic governance, another popular term. So this is normally presented as a good thing. Democratic governance is presented as a good thing, when in fact it can be a very bad thing, and is in fact very un-African. So the term actually means a situation where everyone has their say, but the government or majority has their way. That is the real meaning of democratic governance. That cannot be a good thing. Sometimes this is also called rule of law, but the content of the rule that constitutes the law is hardly questioned. So once it is a rule of law and passes all the formal channels, then it is democratic governance. So, in other words, democratic governance is tyranny of the majority and an exclusion of the interests or the oppression of the minority. We need to eliminate or redefine this ugly term from our governance and development nomenclature. An associated term is good governance. Again, very popular term. So it is normally defined as the situation where the government would take all relevant input on virtually everything and then come to a decision. But they choose and implement what is supposed to be the best options for the collective. Now, this term, good governance, is only useful if there are mechanisms which people can use to hold government to choosing the most reasonable options and the most inclusive options. If those mechanisms don't exist, then good governance means nothing. It just means a talk shop, and after that, decisions are taken by the governors, and they do exactly what they want to do. Unless you have external mechanisms for ensuring a rational choice that is good for the collective and that takes account of the interests of the minorities, good governance is meaningless. What we should be striving for as Africans is people-oriented governance. People-oriented governance is the governance that meets people at the point of their needs. And if that form of governance means you should redistribute resources or engage in affirmative action, you have to do that, even if the majority is against it. It is governance that meets people at the point of their needs. The next term is constitutionalism. During the first session, my friend from Rwanda talked about first wave, second wave, and third wave democratization in Africa. These waves of democratization were characterized by new constitutions. So African countries started developing new constitutions. But again, there is a deceptiveness in that process. Because a constitution is simply the basic and fundamental rules for governance. But a constitution can lead to two things. It can lead to constitutionality, or it can lead to constitutionalism. Now, constitutionality is a very bad thing. Constitutionality means you follow the dictates of what's in the Constitution. And again, it doesn't matter what is in the Constitution. If the Constitution says kill everybody, and you follow it and kill everybody, that is constitutionality. And you have abided by the Constitution. And nobody can question you. And this exists in many African countries, where you have an undemocratic, unpeople-centered constitution, but that is the Constitution. What we should be redefining constitutionalism to mean is limited government. A constitution that doesn't limit the powers of government is not worth the paper it is written on. So our redefinition of third wave or fourth wave or fifth wave African democracy must be democracies which have constitutionalism and not merely what? Constitutionality. I'm getting to the end. Now, the way in which governments behave in their governance is captured under this term, which are called administration. So every leader, every party comes to power with an agenda to govern. The way in which it articulates that agenda and lets it seep through the pores of the nation and get it enacted in reality is the administration. So the administration is not the bureaucracy. The administration changes with the leadership and the party in power. And all the processes involved in rolling out the program of governance is the administration. And unless we capture this properly, we would continue to see the administration as a docile, weak part of governance. That's not true. Many governments have failed because an administration has not aided it to govern. So the administration is as important as the narrow government. Then we have two more definitions, and I'm done. Institutions. The institutions are related very much to the administration, the processes for delivering governance. And the institutions are the repetitive patterns of human behavior. So the way in which people interact given the rules that exist. So the institution is not a commission or a committee or an agency or whatever. Institutions exist outside of buildings. They exist outside of laws. They exist outside of everything. You can just observe the way human beings interact in a given milieu, and that defines the institutions. And again, we need to capture this because there are many grandiose plans and projects in Africa which have gone nowhere because we haven't fully understood the way these can be enacted through institutions, which are not just the passage of a law to set up a commission or the passage of a law to set up an authority, but the way in which the human beings interact. Finally, globalization. Again, globalization is a very nice word. It's always presented as a very beautiful thing. Everyone, everything is allowed to move about. The world becomes one big, happy family, right? But what they fail to tell us, those who define globalization in this way, is that it is the things, the goods, the money, the capital that are free to move about, not the human beings. The human beings are not allowed to move about freely. Every year I go for a new passport because everywhere I go with a Ghanaian passport, I have to get a visa. So the free movement of people as part of globalization is a myth. It is the free movement of capital that is, in fact, what we see today as globalization. The interesting thing is that as the things, the capital moves around and the money moves around, it mops up value. It carries value along with it. So capital comes into Africa, mops up all the value, and takes it out to Europe and the US. But Africans are not allowed to go where? To Europe and the US, where your capital has been mopped up and taken. So you can't continue in that way. You can't continue promoting a definition of globalization that impoverishes you. You have to ensure that any discussion of globalization must be about the twin movement of things and what? Human beings. And you must start with human beings because human beings are more important than things. If the discussion doesn't involve the free movement of human beings, get out of the room and leave because it's not a discussion. It is not a valuable discussion. When this basic, simple, fundamental, elementary fact about globalization is understood in its twin meaning of free movement of people and things, then a meaningful discussion of how to do globalization can commence. Thanks for your attention.